Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We pray and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He makes us amongst those who learn beneficial knowledge and benefit from that which they learn, inshaAllah ta'ala. Before we begin, we wanted to mention this before. We made an announcement about it before, but as most of you know, his sister had passed away a few days ago from cancer. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon her and forgive her and enter her into paradise, inshaAllah ta'ala. He's here if anybody wants to give him your condolences and so on, inshaAllah ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives the family patience during this difficult time as well, inshaAllah. With that said, because of the time change, we have moved our tafsir class, the Decode, to after Isha, just to accommodate the difference in timing, inshaAllah ta'ala. So we'll be starting with our class right now. And then, people can pray. You can pray your sunnah now if you want to leave, or you can pray afterwards. Of course, it is from the sunnah anyways to pray the sunnah at home and not at the masjid to begin with. Inshallah ta'ala. So the class that we're doing is in Usul al-Tafsir, so it's in the principles of tafsir, and we have reached a point where we are talking now about Abdullah ibn Masood radiyallahu anhu. So in Usul al-Tafsir, there's a whole section that actually discusses some of the major Sahaba when it came to doing tafsir. And of course, as we said, tafsir is the exegesis, which is the English equivalent of the word. And in learning tafsir, we talked that there is the main source is the Quran itself. Second source is the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And the third source is the statements of the Sahaba radwanullahi alayhim. So we wanted to discuss three of the Sahaba. We already discussed Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu in detail, and he was actually the first of the Sahaba that we discussed when it came to the Sahaba. The next one is Abdullah ibn Masood. Many of us have heard this name. Abdullah ibn Masood, a lot of times the Prophet ﷺ would not call him this. He would actually call him Ibn Ummi Abd. So he would actually call him by his mother, and this is because his mother actually was one of the people who helped the Prophet ﷺ in a lot of things that he did. Abdullah ibn Masood was one of the first converts to Islam, meaning he accepted Islam very early. There is a narration that's attributed to Abdullah ibn Masood where he says, I accepted Islam and there were only 6 of us that were Muslim that he knew of, 6 or 7, when he accepted Islam. It was that early on, and his first interaction with the Prophet ﷺ is one of 2 incidences. One incident is where he said him and people in his tribe, he is not, by the way, a Qurashi. He's not purely from Quraysh. He's actually from Mawali Quraysh, which are the tribes that were outside of Mecca, who were allied to Quraysh, but he's not a pure Qurashi. And he says that he went to Mecca with some of his tribal members, and they saw the Prophet ﷺ doing tawaf and doing his prayer, and with him was a young boy, and it turns out that this boy was Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu. You can come in, inshallah ta'ala. We'll ask the brothers if they want to move down this way, but that's fine, inshallah ta'ala. So he says that that was the first incident, and he saw them doing the acts of worship, and he was impressed, and he accepted Islam thereafter. There's another narration, and this is perhaps the stronger one and the more famous one, this is where Abdullah ibn Masood, he says he was a shepherd on the outskirts of Mecca, and while he was being a shepherd, he was visited by 2 men, and he didn't know who these men were. And of course it turns out that it was the Prophet ﷺ, and with him was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu. This is in the early days of Islam. They were out in the mountains and they see this young shepherd, and they tell him, do you have any milk? He says, I don't have any milk on me. And if he says, can we take some of the milk? And he says, these are not mine. I am shepherding these goats for someone else. And because of this, the Prophet ﷺ actually respected what he had to say. It wasn't that the Prophet ﷺ was trying to tell him, give me some milk, don't worry about it. No. He wanted to see if they were actually his goats or not. And when he said, theirs are not mine, and I am just a caretaker, I am entrusted with these, the Prophet ﷺ was impressed. And so he said, give me one of the goats that has not, one of the female goats, that is completely dry, meaning there's no milk in its udders. And he brought it, and the Prophet ﷺ then put his hands والسلام, upon the udders, and he made a dua, and he started reciting certain things. And then they filled up with milk. He milked Abu Bakr, and the Prophet ﷺ drank from it. And Abdullah ibn Masood is there in amazement and shock. He's like, and then the Prophet ﷺ, after they drank, he made a dua again, and they shrunk back to their original size. Abdullah ibn Masood, he says, you have to teach me what you just learnt. And when he said this, he says, إِنَّكَ غُلَامٌ مُعَلَّمٌ. He says, this statement right here, إِنَّكَ لَغُلَامٌ مُعَلَّمٌ. He says, you are a taught boy. Meaning you will learn, don't worry. It's as if he's already telling him, you're going to learn a lot, and you don't worry. And of course upon this he accepted Islam and he comes in and whatnot. Abdullah ibn Masood, radiyallahu anhu, is the first person to recite Quran out loud other than the Prophet. So the Prophet ﷺ was the first, of course, to teach the Quran and to recite it out loud to the people of Mecca. But then the second person to ever do this out loud was Abdullah ibn Masood, and he actually got a beating because of this. People didn't like it, they didn't like what he said, but he didn't care because he was going to recite anyways. And he said later on, when people were questioning his knowledge of the Quran, he said, I learned over 70 surahs directly from the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is of course a high manqaba, this is a high standing. Why? Most of the Sahaba, contrary to popular belief, didn't learn all of it directly from the Prophet. A lot of times they would have to catch it from one another. So the Sahaba at the time, when the Prophet ﷺ is alive, were learning from one another, but that they would review it with the Prophet, and the Prophet would hear what they recited, and it was a done deal. But not all of them had that one-on-one opportunity to learn directly from the Prophet ﷺ. But Abdullah ibn Masood, he says, I learned 70 surahs directly from his mouth, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This is obviously a high place, and this is a testimony to the closeness that Abdullah ibn Masood had. In addition to the closeness, there were some visitors. One of them was Abu Musa al-Ash'ari when he came from Yemen to go and visit Medina. He says that when we came to Medina, it took us a few years to realize that Abdullah ibn Masood is actually not related to the Prophet, him or his mother. And he was asked, why did you think this? And he says, because of how often they used to go to the house of the Prophet ﷺ, it was almost on a daily basis. That they would visit him in his house, him and his mother, Ridwanullahi alayhima, that they would go and visit on such a frequent basis that they thought that actually they were related to the Prophet, but they were not related. How did Abdullah ibn Masood then have a relationship with the Prophet ﷺ? Abdullah ibn Masood was in charge of the wudu of the Prophet. He was in charge of the hairbrush of the Prophet. He was in charge of his miswak of the Prophet ﷺ. He was in charge of his wisada, his pillow, and he was in charge of his bedding during his travels. Not when he was local. When he was domestic, this is the job of his wives. But whenever they traveled to an expedition, to whatever they had to do, the Prophet ﷺ entrusted all of his personal items to Abdullah ibn Masood. This is why he had that personal access that many other people did not. Even when they were in Medina, he still took care of a lot of these things if the Prophet ﷺ was not home. Later on, Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman radiallahu anhu, a great Sahabi, people used to come to Hudhayfa and they used to say, we want to learn about the Prophet. And he would actually tell them, don't learn from me, go to this man. And Hudhayfa at the time was in Al-Kufa, which is where Abdullah ibn Masood was, and used to say, there is no one who is like the Prophet ﷺ, especially in his own personal life, than this man. This is because he had that personal access that many people didn't. Meaning in his samt, in the way that he carried himself, in the way that he behaved with others, in the way that he handled himself and whatnot. We also have the famous incident of Abdullah ibn Masood being the one that the Prophet ﷺ asked to recite to him. Remember this incident? He was there alone, it's just them two. And the Prophet ﷺ tells Abdullah ibn Masood, he says, read some Quran to me. And Abdullah ibn Masood is like, what? أقرأه عليك وعليك أنزل. I recite it to you and it's been revealed to you and it doesn't make sense. And you're the one who should be reading to me, not the other way around. And then the Prophet ﷺ said the very famous statement, إني أحب أن أسمعه من غيري. I love to listen to it from someone else as well. This reaffirmation, this confirmation of the Quran and whatnot. And what's beautiful is that when he started to recite, the Prophet ﷺ wasn't correcting him. He wasn't saying, actually no, read it like this, and he was letting him read. Even though, we're assuming Abdullah ibn Masood, his recitation is perfect anyways, but is it as perfect as the Prophet's? No. But this tells us that we shouldn't be too critical of others when they recite the Quran. Even if they make slight mistakes here or there, as long as they're not changing the meaning, we should be more forgiving and more accommodating. Because the purpose of the Quran isn't to become extreme in rigidity in terms of recitation, but we should be extreme in trying to apply it. And this is the point. That's actually why there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says, there will come later a time when people will be more strict in how it's recited than how it's applied. And subhanAllah, this has happened. And you find people who know more about how it's recited than they do about how it's applied. You ask them, okay, what does it mean? He says, I have no clue. But I know that the alif is pronounced this way, and I know that the fa has to come out from this makhraj and from this. Sometimes it becomes too much. I'm not negating this science, by the way, but what I'm saying is, it wasn't revealed for that. It was revealed to be applied and to be understood and to be contemplated. So the Prophet ﷺ asks Abdullah ibn Masood radiallahu anhu to recite to him. He recites, and of course he starts reciting from Surah An-Nisa until he reaches verse 40, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says,
فكيف إذا جئنا من كل أمة بشهيد وجئنا بك على هؤلاء شهيدا.
Says, how is it that when we bring upon every ummah a witness, and we will bring you as a witness upon them? Meaning, this is Allah talking directly to the Prophet. And he has a moment where he tells Abdullah ibn Masood, he says, kafa, enough. And Abdullah ibn Masood looks up and he sees that the Prophet ﷺ is weeping. He's crying because he understands what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling him here, and he leaves him alone. So that obviously is a very important thing. Abdullah ibn Masood, to be continued. This story is narrated by Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu in a hadith that's actually mutawatir. It's very well known. And this incident was when Umar radiallahu anhu sent Abdullah ibn Masood to Al-Kufa. And when he sent him to Al-Kufa, he writes in the letter, he says, I am sending you a man who knows the Quran better than anyone else. And he says, وَلَقَدْ اسْتَأْثَرْتُ بِهِ عَلَيْكُمْ عَنْ نَفْسِي. He says, I have done ithar for you over myself. And what this means is that ithar is where we prefer others over ourselves. It's an Islamic concept. There's many verses that talk about this. وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصًا. They prefer others even if they have a need for it. And so Umar was saying to the people of Kufa, I am sending you a teacher who will teach you the Quran better than anyone else I know, and I am preferring you over myself, because if it were up to me purely, I would keep him here to teach me more. It's as if Umar is saying that I need this man to help me and assist me in understanding the Quran, but I'm preferring you guys because you need him more perhaps than we do here in Medina. And so he sends them. When people then questioned his decision and questioned Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's knowledge, Umar radiallahu anhu narrates this story. He says that we were standing, me and Abu Bakr and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we see in the masjid on one of the sides a man there standing and reciting the Quran in such a beautiful way. He says his recitation was very long, it was elaborate, it wasn't quick, right? And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud used to be of the opinion that quickness is not needed, that you have to actually take your time. He says he was taking his time, he was reciting it beautiful. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, من أراد أن يقرأ القرآن غضا طريا كما نزل فليقرأه على قراءة ابن عبد. He says whoever wants to recite the Quran غضا طريا, he says fresh, basically fresh as it was when it was first revealed. Meaning that same manner, let him recite it just as Abdullah is reciting it now. So he was reciting it in such a beautiful way. This was number one. Then after he's finished his recitation, they said that during his salah he was making a dua. Okay? During his salah he made a dua. And when the Prophet ﷺ saw him about to make dua, he said, Sal tu'ta. He said, ask, may Allah give you. And this dua from the Prophet is so that Abdullah ibn Masood's dua is accepted. And Abdullah ibn Masood started to ask, making a dua. Now he did not know that the Prophet ﷺ had made that dua. Umar was the one who heard the Prophet make that dua, right? So Abdullah ibn Masood doesn't know that the Prophet ﷺ made that dua. And he starts to ask for knowledge that Allah Azza wa Jal teaches him. He starts to ask for a live heart, a heart that actually interacts with its surroundings properly. And he asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Jannah and for forgiveness and so forth. It was as if it was accepted. And Umar narrated that story to defend Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and to say, he has this, and of course you don't have that. So we know that Umar radiallahu anhu assigned him as a teacher in Kufa. We know that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud fought in all of the battles alongside the Prophet ﷺ, and we said that he actually had a task of being the personal servant to the Prophet ﷺ. Later on, while he was in Kufa, this was during the time when he heard that Uthman was gathering the Quran upon one harf and that he ordered all of the masahif to be burnt. We talked about this during our session when we talked about gathering the Quran and compiling it and whatnot. And people who are here remember that session that we had. One of the people who initially objected was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, it demonstrates his knowledge and it demonstrates his care for the knowledge that he had. And he went out on the minbar and he told this to the people, and he said, by Allah, he was objecting to the choice of Zayd bin Thabit. Why Zayd bin Thabit is chosen. And he said that Zayd bin Thabit wasn't even born yet when I was learning directly from the Prophet ﷺ. And this is true. Zayd bin Thabit was so young that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was older, and he's a generation above him. Okay, even though Zayd is a Sahabi and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is a Sahabi, but at this point, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is in his 60s. And Zayd was barely in his 30s. He's 30 years older than him. So he has 30 years of experience and all these things, and he was with the Prophet ﷺ way early on. And on top of this, Zayd bin Thabit was an Ansari. So he started learning the Quran only after the Prophet ﷺ emigrated to Medina, when Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of the first converts, and he had 13 years of a head start upon him. The thing is that he didn't, and later on he actually admits, he says what Uthman did is actually correct. And he says, I made a mistake, and that Zayd was the perfect man for the job. And he says, he realizes that everybody has their place, everybody has this thing, and everybody has. But when he was defending his opinion, he said, there is not a verse, except that I know where it was revealed and who it was revealed about. He remembers those types of things. Because a lot of times we read the verse, right? And when it says the word insan, for example, a lot of times those verses would be revealed while the Prophet ﷺ, just right before, would have had a conversation with a person. And it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning that person in a general reference. This is why we talked about al-am wal-khas. Talked about the specific and we talked about the general. That sometimes the verse might have been revealed at a specific time in reference to a specific individual, but when Allah keeps it general, that means that the general meaning is still applicable. So it's still applicable to our day upon a person who might have a similar description as well. But Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is saying that I know every one of those generalities who it was specifically revealed about. And then he says that if I know that there's a person who is more knowledgeable than me about the book of Allah, who I could travel to on camelback, I would. Of course, what he's saying is that all the people who are more knowledgeable than him in the Quran have passed away. Right? Radwanullah alayhim. And of course he's referring to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But this tells us, so how is this relevant to tafsir? How is this personality relevant to us in tafsir? A lot of times we will read in the books, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says, this word means this, or his tafsir of this ayah is this, or his this. And when you put a personality to who it is saying it, it makes you appreciate it that much more, that you know that there is weight behind this. When we talk about weight, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is a weighty individual. There's that very famous incident that happened when Abdullah ibn Masood climbed upon the tree to fetch something, and some of the Sahaba started laughing at his legs, right? The bottom legs, his calves, how thin his legs were. Even though at the time, maybe in his 20s or 30s, but he was a skinny, scrawny guy. And they started laughing at his legs, and the Prophet ﷺ was there, and he says, "Alama tadhakun, what are you laughing at?" They said, "Min diqqati saqayhi ya Rasulullah." They said, from how tiny his legs are, O Messenger of Allah. And of course, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, "Wallahi, by Allah, innahuma la athqalu min uhudin fi mizanillahi ta'ala." And he says that they are heavier than the mountain of Uhud with the scale of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You think that they're light, but they're actually very heavy because of who this individual is. He left Kufa during the time of Uthman, and he goes back to Al-Madinah. And one of the most amazing, subhanAllah, mind-blowing incidents, one of the first converts also that we know of is Abu Dharr. And if you guys know the story of Abu Dharr is the convert who came to the Prophet ﷺ, accepted Islam and left. He used to be a highway robber. And he was very rigid and very strict, and he used to come and visit in Mecca, but he wasn't a Meccan. But he used to live outside, and he's one of the first converts. Abu Dharr said, "I accepted Islam," and there were not even 10 Muslims alive at the time. But then later on, Abu Dharr, he came to Medina, and then he eventually lived there and whatnot. And the Prophet ﷺ, he told Abu Dharr, he says, "Yamshi wahidan, وَيَعِيشُ وَحِيدًا وَيَمُوتُ وَحِيدًا." That he says to Abu Dharr, he will live alone. He walks alone because he came at one battle walking alone by himself. And it tells him that you walk alone, you will live alone, and you will die alone. And it was true that at his time, during his time, Abu Dharr lived outside of Medina due to some discussion with Uthman. And Uthman told him, "I think it's best for you to live outside of Medina." And Abu Dharr agreed. And he lived outside of Medina, and he lived there with his wife. And he became sick on his deathbed. And he's alone. They're in the middle of the desert. Nobody's there. And his wife gets worried. She says, "I'm afraid." And he says, "Why are you afraid?" And she says, "Because if you die, there's nobody to pray your janazah. Nobody is going to take care of you." And he says, "Don't worry. The Prophet ﷺ told me that there will be a group of righteous people who will do my janazah. Don't worry." She says, how are you saying this? We're in the middle of the desert. There's nobody here. He says, "I know that this is the truth because the Prophet ﷺ said it, so I have no worry." And he died, radiallahu anhu. And his wife became sad. She goes out onto the main highway that's passing by, and a group was coming from Al-Kufa. She meets them, and in this group is Abdullah ibn Masood, also one of the first 10 converts to Islam. And he had the honor of washing and preparing his body and then praying upon him Salatul Janazah. He did that, and then Abdullah ibn Masood passed away not too long after this. He goes back to Medina. Uthman called him. He goes to Medina. As he's staying in Medina, Uthman needs him for a few things, and then eventually he gets sick. He stays there in Medina, and then he passes away. When he passed away, he had Az-Zubayr do his janazah. Why Az-Zubayr? Az-Zubayr was actually the person who the Prophet ﷺ paired him up when they did the mu'akha, the brotherhood. He did the mu'akha between Abdullah ibn Masood and Az-Zubayr, even though they're both technically muhajirun. They were both muhajirun, but he did this because Az-Zubayr is Qurashi, Abdullah ibn Masood is not. And he wanted to keep them close. He wanted them to benefit from one another and whatnot. And for the last 2 to 3 years, Abdullah ibn Masood was not collecting his salary. And people asked him, "Why aren't you collecting his salary?" Uthman even was asking, "Why aren't you collecting his salary?" He said, "I don't need it." And so Uthman knew how much he was owed, but he didn't collect it. On his deathbed, he said, "I want Az-Zubayr radiallahu anhu to take care of my affairs," because of his closeness to Az-Zubayr. And he said, "To the extent that I do not give my daughters permission to marry unless Az-Zubayr is the actual one who approves it." He made Az-Zubayr the wali of his daughters after his death, because he trusted Az-Zubayr, even though he had other relatives and whatnot, but he entrusted more of his affairs to Az-Zubayr. And he had sons. When he passed away, Az-Zubayr prayed his janazah. They buried him in Al-Baqi', they buried him there in Medina, near the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. And it is said that Az-Zubayr went to Uthman and he said, "Uthman, how much should he have taken because of his salary?" He said he has 3 years worth. And they counted it, it was 15,000 dirhams. And he says he took those 15,000 and he distributed it to Abdullah ibn Masood's children. Because when Abdullah ibn Masood died, he had nothing. He literally did not have a penny to his name, because that's the type of lifestyle that he lived. When people would ask him, why are you living such a lifestyle? He's like, I'm not here for the dunya. I'm not here to collect things or to appropriate or to gather or to have savings or anything like this. I'm here to teach people. I'm here to benefit myself and to benefit others. And so of course, they got his back salary and they gave it to his children, and that way they could actually survive. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless them and bless the entirety of the ummah. That is a little bit about Abdullah ibn Masood. Does anybody have any questions about Abdullah ibn Masood? Any issues? Abdullah ibn Masood, just so that you know, in terms of the Quran and the tafsir, his qira'ah is a little bit different than the qira'ah that we recite with today. Meaning it wasn't 100% Qurashi, because he is not a Qurashi. Remember, the harf that we have that's in the Mus'haf is mainly a Qurashi harf. So it was slightly different. Even his Mus'haf, radiyallahu anhu, the one that he eventually gave up to be burnt with all of the other masahif, and he actually cried over it. He said, Wallah, he had notations in the margins and all of these things, and he tried to save as much as that as he could before it was burnt, but that he had to give it up to be burnt. His Mus'haf was organized different than our Mus'haf. In his Mus'haf, for example, he didn't have Surah Al-Fatiha. And some people thought, there's a mistake, a misconception out, that because in the Mus'haf of Abdullah ibn Masood there isn't Surah Al-Fatiha, that they assume that he thought that it's not from the Quran. And that's actually not the case. We have it very clearly where he says that I only wrote what I was afraid to be lost. There's no fear upon Al-Fatiha to ever be lost, right? Everybody has it memorized. It's not going to be forgotten. We recite it every day. He doesn't need to write it down. That's why he didn't write it down. And that he started his Mus'haf with Surah Al-Baqarah. But then the second surah was Surah Al-Nisa. And the third surah was Surah Al-Imran. He did this because he heard the Prophet ﷺ recite it in that order. And there is a hadith that Hudhayfa was the one who was praying with the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet started with Al-Baqarah, and then he read Surah Al-Nisa, and then he read Surah Al-Imran. He didn't read it in the order that we have it today, which is the answer, by the way, to the question that sometimes we get: can I read the Quran out of order in the Salah? Meaning in the first rak'ah, I recite, let's say, Surah Al-Naba, but then in the second rak'ah I recite Al-Imran. Right? Surah Al-Naba is from the very end, Surah Al-Imran is from the very beginning. Can I do that on different rak'ahs? And the answer is yes. Because even the Prophet ﷺ did that. He didn't necessarily recite it in the order that we have it in this Mus'haf. This is why the closer opinion to how was the Quran ordered in terms of the surahs, that this was actually done due to a consensus among the majority of the Sahaba. The one who differed was Abdullah ibn Masood, because he had a certain reasoning behind that. But it wasn't, the rest agreed that this is the order that we have, and this is why it is the order that we have today. By the way, he also left out Al-Ma'uwidhatayn and Qul Huwallahu Ahad. So in his Mus'haf, he did not have Qul Huwallahu Ahad, he did not have Qul A'udhu bi Rabbil Falaq, and he did not have Qul A'udhu bi Rabbin Nas. And people asked, why is this? Did he not think that they were from the Quran? No, it's because, again, he said, there's no fear that this should ever be lost. Every Muslim knows these 3 surahs, right? There's no, I hope, that there's no Muslim, except that they have those surahs memorized. And that's why he left it out of his Mus'haf as well. Okay? You have a question? Yeah, go ahead. Well, he didn't even include it in his Mus'haf. No. He didn't include it, like I said, because his goal wasn't to write a Mus'haf that's to be carried. This was his own personal copy that he wrote with his own hand. Does that make sense? And on top of this, by the way, when he wrote it with his hand, he was at the time dictating to others to write their own Mus'haf as well, from his own memory. And a man travels from Al-Kufa and goes to Umar, and he says, Ya Umar, I have a complaint. He says, what? He says, there is a man in Iraq and he is dictating the Quran from his memory, and he's telling people to write and that this is the Quran. And Umar, his face, they said he got red, he got upset, he got angry. He's like, what are these people doing? Why are they doing this? Who is this man? Tell me his name. And he says, it's Abdullah ibn Masood. And then he comes and he's like, Abdullah ibn Masood. He says, by Allah, there is no one, and he says that statement, there is no one more qualified to write the Quran with his hand than him. Let him do that. But he said if it was anybody else, I would have done something to him. But Abdullah ibn Masood, he knew that this person is going to be trustworthy, that we can entrust him with that. We don't have any fear. Makes sense? Yes?
So you said he's not a Qurayshi, so his script was different than the Qurayshi script.
Slightly, yes. It's going to be a little slightly. And his accent is also perhaps a little bit. But he recited, so when he learned them from the Prophet, when he said, I learned 70 surahs, these are taken directly from the Prophet ﷺ. So we know that his qira'ah is 100% correct. There's no doubt about that. It's just that the Prophet ﷺ, remember, he made that dua in order to reveal the Quran in sab'at ahruf. And the most correct opinion is that these are the dialects of the Arabs. And that perhaps he had his dialect as well, in that. Yeah, go ahead.
He was assigned to Kufa, but then he died in Medina.
Yes.
And the Hanafi madhab derives its sources from him. So
Yes.
he left 2 students before he moved back to Medina. His knowledge was left in Kufa, so it was followed by one.
Yeah, exactly. So because he spent so much time in Kufa, like a lot of time, that's exactly correct. A lot of the Hanafi madhab goes back to the opinions of Abdullah ibn Masood. That's exactly right now. Yeah. You'll find him in the chains. Yes?
Some people study the way the surahs are organized.
Uh-huh.
And especially they want to the one surah talking about something.
Now.
The way then the following surah talks something and they want to create a link.
Yes.
So is it something for me, is it something worth studying as far as the message is there in every chapter?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you say now.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are a few different types of orders, right? So the orders of the words of the Quran, can we change that? No. The orders of even the ayat, can we change that? No. But the orders of the surahs, it seems that it is divinely inspired, but it's divinely inspired through the actions of the Sahaba, if that makes sense. Because the Prophet ﷺ didn't leave a clear indication that these surahs go in this order. There's not something completely definitive. And the way that we got it, the clearest indication to this is that Zayd bin Thabit himself says that on the al-arda al-akhira, so the last review of the Quran before the Prophet ﷺ died, that Ramadan. Remember, he reviewed it twice that year. Every year he would review the Quran with Jibreel, right? And it would be once. And that the last year he reviewed it twice, and this is what we call al-arda al-akhira, the last review. And that Zayd bin Thabit was there for that last review, and he says that the Prophet ﷺ recited it in this order during that last review. And that's where we get the order from. Does that make sense? Where it goes Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, and so forth. Plus, the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith, he would always pair Al-Baqarah wa Al-Imran. Where he says, recite Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, and then he calls them Al-Zahrawain. Then he says, on the Day of Judgment, they will come like clouds above the creation, and that they will be intercessors for the believer who memorizes, etc., etc. So there's a lot of blessings that they're paired up, and that's why it is the correct opinion that Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran go first, and then Surah An-Nisa. Make sense? Now, looking into the wisdom behind the order of the Quran, this is something that there have been many scholars who wrote about it. Many scholars didn't even pay attention to this at all. And it wasn't that they didn't think about it, it was that they didn't think that it was worth the time to spend on it. That more importantly, you need to understand what the verses themselves say. Sah? Now, is there further wisdom to be derived from the order? Without a doubt, yes, there is. But we can never be definitive unless there's a clear hadith or there's a clear indication. So when we talk about, for example, why is the wisdom that Al-Baqarah is first and Al-Imran is second and then Nisa is third, why in that order? There are many people, and the scholars say, well, if you look at Al-Baqarah, it is the only surah that contains all 5 pillars of Islam. It is the only surah that has so many issues. It's the longest surah. It's introducing the idea that this is a continuation of the messages of the people before us. This is why the beginning of the surah talks about Bani Israel for so much. But then after and later on, it talks about the Muslimin and how they should behave and whatnot. Right? And it's the most comprehensive surah in the Quran, etc., etc. And then they say Al-Imran is an introduction to the Christians and the Jews, etc. So there are scholars who have written about this, but they can never be 100% definitive. We can't say this is the reason why, no. But they can say some of the wisdoms we derive, and Allah knows best at the end. And we can do that. And so one of the best books about this is a book by Imam al-Suyuti rahimahullah, where he says it's Kitab Asrar Tartib al-Quran, the book on the secrets of the order of the Quran. By the way, Suyuti wrote this book when he was very young, relatively speaking. He was only in his 20s when he wrote this. And Suyuti lived to be very old, and he wrote other books as well. But he wrote this early on as a way to try to derive some of that meaning. There's another scholar, his name is Al-Biqa'i, and he writes about also in his tafsir why verses come after one another, why surahs come after one another as well. From more modern scholars, there is At-Tahir bin Ashur. He's the writer of At-Tahrir wa Tanwir, that book of tafsir, an amazing book, huge, and he also goes into a lot of these things as well. If you look at like Ibn Kathir, he doesn't talk about this at all. He won't even go into it because there's no like sanad to go back to, and he's all about the asanid, so he won't necessarily discuss this topic. Yeah. No. Yeah, so his mother accepted Islam also at an early time with him, and that his mother would help some of the mothers of the believers and whatnot. She was also in the service. But that's all really, in doing the research, that's all I really found about his mother. But that the Prophet ﷺ, when he used to mention him by the name of his mother, shows that the Prophet ﷺ had some respect for his mother as well. Of course, he grew up without his father. Yeah. Good? Any other questions, inshaAllah ta'ala? He's not one of the 10 of Al-Ashra al-Mubashshara. But does that make him any less? And the answer is no, we can't say that definitively. Al-Ashra al-Mubashshara, the 10 given glad tidings, are very special for certain reasons. Number one is that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned them all in one gathering when he was giving the khutbah. So the Prophet ﷺ gets on the minbar, and as he's talking to the people, he starts to say, Abu Bakr is in Jannah, Umar is in Jannah, Uthman is in Jannah, Ali is in Jannah. And he starts going down the list. And it was towards the end of his life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's as if he's telling the companions that after I die, you need to look up to these 10. This is why Umar radiallahu anhu, when he put the 6 of Ashura, they were from the 10 anyways. This is because Umar himself, he remembered. He says, I know that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned these people and that he passed away while being pleased with them. And that this is why I'm too. This doesn't negate the people who are outside of them. The mothers of the believers are there. And there are other people who were given glad tidings of Jannah without being in that list. So anybody that the Prophet ﷺ did say that they will have Jannah, we believe that they will have, and that doesn't decrease their degree from these people necessarily. But that in terms of ranking, those 10 are perhaps a rank above it. That doesn't diminish the place of Abdullah ibn Masood. Yeah, inshallah. Or people like Abdullah ibn Masood, that's the idea. Okay, good. After this we have Abdullah ibn Abbas, but we'll save him inshallah ta'ala for next week. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, there's a lot to say about him as well, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullah khairan, barakallahu feekum. Subhanakallahumma hamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.